Hello and welcome to Ticker Climate. My name is Holly Stearns. It's great to have you tuning in every single week. On Ticker Climate, we tackle the climate crisis facing our planet, and then we examine what actions governments as well as corporations need to be taking. Each week, we speak with key movers and shakers in this space. My co-host Scott Hamilton is a climate change and energy expert, and Scott is an author, researcher and policy advisor. With a mission to tackle the big issues and accelerate climate change action, Scott joins me live now. Scott, great to have you company.
Hello, Holly. Great to be here again.
Let's get right into it. This week, our guest is trade unionist involved in the waterfront dispute, former Minister for Climate Change, Industry and Innovation in the Gillard government. Now he's the chair of Industry Super Australia, which represents 16 of Australia's biggest industry funds and the vast bulk of the $630 billion industry superannuation sector. Greg Combert, thanks for your time.
Great to be with you, Holly.
Hi. Hello, Greg. Great to see you again.
Hey, Scott. How are you?
Well, thank you. And so really keen to kick off and talk about carbon targets, if that's okay. Now, you were on the special advisory panel that advised the Victorian government recently. Could you tell us about the process that you went through in order to work out what was the correct range or the correct targets for the state of Victoria in terms of carbon emissions?
Well, it was a rigorous and fairly lengthy process because we wanted the the recommendations we made to the Victorian government obviously to be as soundly based as possible. And in essence, we estimated what the carbon budget would be for Victoria in a circumstance as per the Paris Agreement where temperature rises were to be held to 1.5 degrees and certainly below 2 degrees C. So we estimated the carbon budget for Victoria and formulated our targets according to that, and obviously had regard to economic impacts and social and regional impacts. But it was an extensive piece of work leading to the recommendations that we made.
Greg, we know that Biden has recently set a target of 50% by 2030. The EU is at 55% and the UK is higher still. Is the Victorian target of 45% by 2030 too small, do you think?
Well, it's a target that the state government adopted of 45 to 50% by 2030. And that's about right, particularly taking into account the fact that the Victorian economy is probably the most emissions intensive in Australia. It's relied, of course, for many decades now upon brown coal-fired power generation, and it has a big transformation task ahead of it. And when you're formulating targets, it is important to be mindful of the economy and the industries that you're dealing with and how difficult a transition might be. So I think the range that they came up with, it's certainly within the range that we recommended to the state government, although at the lower end, but 45 to 50% below 2005 levels for an economy like Victoria's, I think's, ambitious and credible.
Thanks, Greg. Now moving to the federal government. Now we all know that the current Paris targets of 26 to 28% by 2030 are very low. And we've seen the Prime Minister sort of trying to crab walk between a net zero target by 2050 in the lead up to Glasgow. Could you give us a bit of your reflections on what's going on here and whether we'll see any move from the Australian government?
Well, I think as all of the Australian community can see that there are deep divisions within the coalition government about climate policy, and it's essentially made it impossible for the Morrison government and the Turnbull government and the Abbott government to have a credible position on targets or anything else concerning climate policy. So I don't anticipate that's going to change in any kind of a hurry. It's unfortunate for the country, and we're getting left behind as a consequence of the paralysis within the Morrison government about climate policy. You know, we're 26 to 28% target at 2030 is clearly inadequate and very much out of step, as you pointed out, Scott, with the major economies around the world, and more will be expected of Australia as we head towards the Glasgow conference later this year.
Greg, what should the government and opposition target be for 2030? And then what does this actually cost?
Well, I think from the work that I've already mentioned concerning the Victorian government in target setting, what we settled upon was that a target of at least 45% emissions being below around 2005 levels by 2030, that would be the minimum that I think would be expected of Australia to contribute to the pursuit of net zero by 2050. It is understood that we've got an electricity and energy system that's been heavily dependent upon coal and other fossil fuels, but nonetheless, we're an advanced economy and we need to invest in the transition that's necessary in our energy system and in other important sectors of the economy too. So that's really what you'd be looking at least 45% target by 2030.
Agree with you there, Greg. Now, it's one thing to have targets, of course, but you need policies to actually get there too. Now, I was working for the Victorian government and sort of watched you in the federal sphere working on the CPRS, as it was first of all, and then the carbon tax, which of course we saw got killed by Tony Abbott. Is a carbon price still the right policy measure, do you think? And what do you think is the way forward?
Forgive me for having a giggle, but as the architect of the so-called carbon tax, I still think that a carbon pricing mechanism is the most economically efficient, the lowest cost way to achieve emissions reductions across the economy. It's the most equitable way of going about emissions reductions. And however, as we have seen over the last 10 years, and particularly when I was the climate change minister, it's difficult and it's politically complex as well, and it's why to opportunist populist campaigns such as was run by Tony Abbott. But it is the most rational economic policy response and the most environmentally effective as well. Having said that, given the complexities with it from a political point of view, many other approaches have been tried and adopted in some jurisdictions, and they're necessarily going to be more costly, but the costs are oftentimes hidden to the community. But I'm still an adherent to the merits of a carbon pricing scheme.
Yes, speaking of carbon pricing and tariffs, Greg, we've seen the EU announcing they're going to bring in a carbon border tariff from 2026. What does this mean for Australian farmers and businesses and industry? And do you think that some of the other big players, such as USA and China, will follow, I suppose?
I think this type of response is inevitable from countries that are doing, their fair share of the heavy lifting in emissions reductions and bearing the cost of that. To look around and see in another advanced economy like Australia not doing its fair share, even still disputing the science. Some of the figures in the government clearly are of that mind. Other countries are going to say enough is enough. The task here is so urgent, so significant that they will move to policies like this. So it's no surprise to me that the European Union is moving to put in place border adjustment mechanisms, a carbon tariff that will hit Australian exports to the EU, particularly if we are exporting emissions-intensive goods. And you're right, the EU would consider, for example, beef exports, many agricultural exports to be emissions intensive, along with more obvious things like aluminium or steel, for example, if we were exporting steel to Europe. And this will put Australian producers at a competitive disadvantage, and potentially quite a significant one. And I think also under the Biden administration, we'll see this discussed more and more. They've got a target, as you've noted, of 50% emissions reduction by 2030. That's going to involve significant economic adjustment and cost in the US and they'll expect Australia to be doing the same. Other economies are going to take the same path, and it's not difficult to see either that China may in fact go down this path, given their current attitude towards Australia on a number of economic issues. So all of this is an imperative for the Australian government to get its act together. And I mean, in an ideal circumstance, you'd like to see the Morrison government going to the Glasgow conference with not only appropriate targets, but a set of policy measures to implement them and give the international community some confidence that we're going to play a fair role.
Greg, moving to your role now as the chair of super funds, I mean, what is the role climate change plays in making investment decisions, and what are the risks and also, for that matter, opportunities for super funds?
Well, the business community, absent government action, has moved ahead because I think people in the business community can well see what the science is saying and are responding to it, and are responding to governments globally, committing to the objectives of the Paris Agreement in particular. It's now a pretty common feature to find amongst major corporations a commitment to achieve net zero within their portfolio of assets by 2050. I chair a funds management business for the industry super funds. We are very big investors in infrastructure globally as well as in Australia. We've committed across our portfolio to achieve net zero by 2050. We're developing interim targets as well. We've committed to net zero within each of the assets within our portfolio of infrastructure assets too. And we are serious about achieving it, so that we are plotting the pathway to achieve these things. For example, by looking at how we can enter into major power purchasing agreements to purchase renewable energy for many of the assets that we operate and bring our emissions down by that means. But there are many things that we will be considering. We can obviously we'll be making a proper investment case. These changes need to be in the best interests of our investors and the members of super funds, and they are. And so we're doing a lot of work, and that's going on globally, and investors are expecting businesses to go down this path. And if you're a business like the one that I chair, IFM Investors, and you're operating in different jurisdictions globally, we've got greater certainty in places like the EU now, where the targets are clear and the expectations are clear.
Yeah, Greg, we do have to unfortunately wrap things up. The time goes so quickly on this show every single week. Lastly, I do have a personal question for you. I mean, you spent years fighting for a decent climate and energy policy in Australia. What do you say to the next generation wanting strong climate change action?
Oh, keep fighting. It's just so important for future generations that we bring about this transition. And it's not easy, it's not going to be easy, but change is actually happening very rapidly. Technology is moving ahead, business is changing, governments, although not ours, are embracing the targets that are necessary. And, so for younger people in particular, just keep fighting to achieve change because it's so important for the future.
Wonderful. Greg, thank you so much for your time and your insight on this topic. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. And that's all we have time for today on Ticker Climate. Thank you very much to Scott and Greg for their time. Until next time, I'm Holly Stearns.
On Ticker News, supersonic travel and the aircraft of the future.
Almost 20 years since the last Concorde flight, so much has changed about how we travel and communicate.
This is pretty exciting.
The boom supersonic overture is taking shape and taking orders, but will it take to the air?
Aircraft is just a paper airplane at the moment.
The experts, the predictions and the reality. Are we ready to step back into supersonic travel?
So you're never going to get to your destination quicker, regardless of who you fly with. Pack your bags, we've got you covered right here on Ticker News.